think about my idea to turn Aug into a hybrid heal DPS, which fills in the heal role. See, I personally don't think, like, I just don't get it. Like, to me, this is so obvious. I don't think a hybrid role can ever be balanced unless we have a specific role for it, right? Like, if we have a role that is a support role that the game is balanced around, then of course it will work, right? Like, let's say M+ will be changed, so one support needs to be brought. So we have a tank, we have 3 damage dealers, we have 1 support, and we have 1 healer or something like that. And support is like an actual role that you can play. Then hybrid role specs make sense. But even if a Aug Evoker is a hybrid between a heal and a DPS, and it's a healer, well, then it causes issue for the healer role, right? Because if a hybrid heal/DPS spec is considered a healer, and they bring more DPS than a healer, then you'll just bring that role. Like, I don't think you can ever create a support that is only considered one role, and they then buff other roles too. Like, that just doesn't make sense. So, in my opinion, the only way support role does work in the current state of World of Warcraft is by making a support role only buff its own role. You know what I mean? So I think a support role can exist as a damage dealer if they only buff damage dealers. Because then they're not a problem. Then they are considered just a normal damage dealer, except that they're not the ones doing the damage. They give the damage to other people, right? Like, then I think it's totally possible for it to exist in a balanced state, where it's not overpowered and it's not underpowered. You can just balance the numbers. That's it, right? As long as the damage that they contribute to the group is the same amount of damage that a normal quote-unquote damage dealer does, then it's totally fine. Now, the problem, of course, if someone is considered a damage dealer, which Aug Evoker is, and they buff other roles that are not considered damage dealers, then all of a sudden it creates a complete imbalance, and it just can't be tuned properly anymore, because how are you supposed to do that? How are you supposed to tune a role that can do things, or tune a class or spec that can do things that no other spec of this same role can do? Like, it's just a very similar explanation, or a very similar situation we had was with Surrender to Madness priests. At the start of Legion, Shadow Priest got Surrender to Madness, which was a high-risk, high-reward playstyle where if you ran out of sanity, you died, right? And it did make sense the way Blizzard explained it, where they were like, oh, well, it's a high-risk, high-reward thing, so if you use the talent, you're gonna do a lot of damage, but it's also very difficult and you can die. So it's like you're risking a lot to get a lot of damage out of it, and if you fail, you die, you do no damage, right? The problem was that no other damage dealer had the option to do a high-risk, high-reward playstyle, so it was not balanceable, right? How do you balance something that only one spec of that role has access to? You can't really. So they had to remove it eventually, or like nerf it so no one played it anymore because obviously it was just broken. I think the real problem at the moment is keys are too easy on timer. I mean, that is another issue for sure, 100%, yeah. Like, I do think that Aug Evoker in general is always going to be an issue, the way it exists. But if the timers wouldn't be so easy, then Aug Evokers would lose a lot of value, of course. Yeah, I agree. But that's, like, I just don't think a spec should exist that has to do, like, shitty damage. And then the only reason for them to not be broad is if you don't need more damage than what an Aug can do. Like, it's like saying Aug is baseline always broad, until you need more damage, then you bring something else. Like, I don't think that should be the case. But anyway, I do agree that Keys timers are way too easy. Almost all dungeons are just, can you survive? And I do think that surviving is, I mean, I talked about this last season as well, and the previous season too. I do think that surviving should be part of the skill of high M+, right? Because I think min-maxing survivability is a cool thing that you can do in M+, that is pretty fun, and that is part of M+, and always has been. But it's just too much at the moment. Like, honestly, if you don't wipe on a boss sometimes, you like end up in the last boss with like so much time left that you don't even know what to do with all the time. Like, it's really dumb. And I personally just, in general, think that it's much more interesting to min-max damage and efficiency in a dungeon than to min-max survivability, because there's only so much you can do with survivability. Like, an individual player can only do so much to survive. Like, what are you gonna do, right? You have your defensives, you can coordinate them with your group, you can skill more defensive talents, you can change your flasks, you can change your enchants, you can run a tank trinket, but at some point you're done, right? You can't be more defensive at some point. The amount of things you can do for survivability is much, 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 much smaller than the amount of things you can do for efficiency in a dungeon, right? To be faster in a dungeon, you can do like a million different things. You can pull differently, you can use your cooldowns differently, you can play different trinkets, you can... I mean, there's like countless things you can do to improve efficiency and speed in a dungeon and to min-max your damage and everything. Like how you move between packs, like there's so many things. And that by default is going to be more interesting to optimize because you just have more tools available to you, and it's just, yeah. Well, with survivability, you're very limited. Therefore, if survivability is the main factor for you to time the key or not, then it's just generally more boring, in my opinion. Hey Tadman, happy Friday to you as well. That kind of happened in the past too with other specs, like Rogues and Havocs have kind of been supported in the past. I mean, have they though? I'm not sure I fully agree. Whenever people said that Rogue is required for Shroud and whatnot, then it just came out to not be true, because as soon as they were nerfed or as soon as they were not so good anymore damage-wise, then somehow people managed to drop the Rogue, even though their utility was not nerfed. So how did people manage to just drop the Rogue all of a sudden if it's so required? I just never thought that was true. I just thought that Rogue was really strong utility-wise, but people played with Rogues because they were so good damage-wise. And then on top of that, of course, you utilize their utility because they were part of the comp. And then, of course, you utilize all of their utility, right? But I do think that people would have figured out how to play without Rogues if they were just not strong damage-wise. Well, with Aug Evokers, I don't think that's the case. Like, you can do a dungeon without a Rogue, right? Because if all you need is Shroud and single target interrupts and control, if that is what you need, then you can get that differently, or you can pull differently to make sure that you do not require the Rogue's utility, right? And you can do the same thing with other classes too. But Aug Evoker survivability that they provide, that cannot be like counteracted. You can't just say, oh, we're gonna bring a different class and we're gonna get our survivability somehow else. That doesn't work, right? So if the limiting factor is survivability, then the Aug Evoker is by default like the class they need to bring, right? While with other things, like with other utility like CC and interrupts and Shroud, like in all of these other utility spells, I think they can be somehow replaced. Maybe not always like perfectly, but you can do it. Well, but Evoker cannot, right? Like it's just yeah, you can bring tankier classes or something, but there's only so much you can do. I think having a support role would bust the rules of Mythic Plus wide open. Imagine if they didn't necessarily make a class that is buffing the group, but rather buff/augment around more difficult affixes, which would allow for more play with key times. I mean, I think it would be interesting if M Plus would have a support role. The problem is, it would have to be like a 6th player that you're adding, kind of. Because you can't really replace a damage dealer and replace it with a support role. Because there's so many damage dealers in the... Like, there's way too many damage dealers. You can't just say, oh, you only need 2 damage dealers in M+. Then no one would ever get invited anymore to M+. Any damage dealer. We already have a hard time getting invited as damage dealers right now. Because the ratio between the amount of damage dealers you need versus tanks and healers you need in M+, is completely off compared to raiding, right? So there's just like tons and tons and tons of infinite damage dealers that want to play in Plus. And on the other hand, we have like much less tanks and healers available. If you change that to only 2 damage dealers, that would be horrible. So you would need to make it 6-player dungeons rather than 5, which of course would be very difficult to do because they would have to change kind of everything. That'd be chaos, and the amount of CC would have available in the group would be so much. So they would have to add more casts that the mobs are casting probably to make sure it's not too easy, and it would be a bit difficult. And on top of that, they would also have to add more support specs because you can't add a support role and then only have 1 support spec, and we all know that that's not gonna happen. Like Blizzard cannot just add 10 support specs from one day to the next. Like, how are they gonna do that? That would require so much time and testing and everything. Delete healers. Actually, good point. Maybe changing the dungeons again to require more. But that's the thing, like I think Blizzard is in a situation where they kind of had to buff the incoming damage in Plus a lot because we have so many, we have so much survivability as just in Dragonflight in general, people have a lot of survivability, right? Even just damage dealers, even without an Arc Evoker, people have a lot of survivability. So they had to buff the damage so much to make sure that the healers are still required. And as you can clearly see, they still aren't required. So even though the limiting factor for us to time a key is survivability, we still don't require a healer to do that, which is crazy to think about, right? So the solution for them would be to like make the timers a lot shorter so people require more damage. But then what if we don't survive the boss anymore, right? Like it's like a fine line they would have to hit. And then the damage would also be like super dumb. And then healers still wouldn't be required. You would play even less healers then. If they shorten the timers, you would see even less healer keys, right? And that's like the biggest problem. If they nerf the timer, healers would be dropped even more. Because right now the damage income is already really high. But healers are still just not needed. It's really dumb. I'm a bit sad because I asked them about this in the interview. And they kind of... Like they acknowledged the issue, but they didn't say that they have any plans for fixing that. Which was a bit discouraging because like at least they acknowledged the issue. They said, yeah, it's true, but then they said, no, we're not gonna remove defensives, right? So it's like, I don't know. Just remove all personal defensives and bake those into healer kits. I mean, you don't even have to bake anything into healer kits. You literally can just remove defensives of damage dealers and leave the healers the way they are. like, because then by default the incoming damage that the mobs and bosses do would have to be adjusted and nerfed. But we all know how angry people are when you take away stuff from them, because like that's another big problem with Blizzard like generally changing the game. Like sometimes Blizzard does something that does make sense, but like an average player will just not understand and not even try to understand. And then they get angry, right? Like for example, pruning. Whenever Blizzard takes away spells because of bloat, because we just have too many abilities, like pruning makes a lot of sense to me when you think about it. Because you don't want to have a million abilities. First of all, people don't have the keybinds for that. And second of all, it's just overwhelming, right? Now, it sucks if you take away an ability that you actually liked, but it's always going to be the case, right? There's always going to be somebody that liked that ability. So pruning abilities is kind of like a necessary evil that they have to do if they want to keep adding more spells. And because we as players, we want new spells, but we also don't want to get rid of the old ones, but we also don't want to have too many spells. So like the average WoW player wants new spells, doesn't want to get rid of old spells, but also complains if we need too many keybinds. So it's like, what are you supposed to do? So they have to just ignore the player in that case because they're not being reasonable. So they ignore the players, take away abilities, and people are going to be angry, right? And sometimes Blizzard, I think, weighs between, okay, do I want to make the players angry for the greater good later on? Or do I not want to do that? And I think sometimes Blizzard would rather not make the average player angry, even if it would be good for them in the long run, because the people that get affected by it are like a smaller group of people. For example, right now, I think when it comes to the M+ issue that we talked about with the defensives and stuff, I think it's mainly a problem for high-end players. Like, it's mainly a problem for high-end M+ players, and it's mainly a problem for, like, Mythic guilds that clear the content really early, right? For everyone else, this defensive thing is maybe not that big of a problem. But if Blizzard takes away defensives, everyone would get angry. Well, not everyone. I think the people that actually understand the issue, they wouldn't be angry, right? But the average player would certainly be angry if you take away defensives, because they don't understand why this is happening. And then they're like, oh my god, like, you're taking away all my stuff, and like now I'm not tanky anymore, and I'm reliant on the healer, like blah blah blah, right? So I think they're probably like, okay, we understand it's a problem, but if we take away defenses, people are going to be angry, and it's only a really big issue for like the high-end community, so maybe we just leave it. At least that's how I can explain it to myself, because otherwise I don't see why they wouldn't address the issue when they understand that it's an issue. It's a problem for the casual and plus players too, because they're expected to use defenses but don't do. I agree that it's also a problem for the casual player base, but they don't know that, I think. Like, I'm not saying that it's not an issue for the others, it's just that they're unaware of the solution to the issue. And even if Blizzard would write a blue post and explain why they're doing it, people would still just not read the explanation, would not understand the explanation, wouldn't... I think so, at least. Well, I don't know. Like, I don't know if this is true, or I'm just saying that that might be something that is holding Blizzard back for fixing it. I'm not sure if that's actually the case, or if there's another reason why they're not fixing it. But there must be some reason why they're not fixing it, because they know that it's a thing, so I don't know.